All right, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to send around a photocopy of the first 2 chapters of the book that we're working our way through, the Bible from Scratch. Now, if you've already got a copy of the book, you don't need this, but if you would pass it along, I'll send it on around. And just sort of a disclaimer. When we're participating in the class, when we're answering questions, number 1, there's no bad questions, there's no dumb questions, and number 2, the assumption isn't that you should already know what the answer to the question is. We're just sharing as we have a sense that maybe we have an idea about it, or maybe we have a follow-up question. So. Truly, everybody participate as much as you feel comfortable. Because we really are just trying to sort of build our understanding of the Bible, particularly the New Testament, from scratch. Thank you. If you completed one of these surveys, from last week, thank you much. You'll send those around to me. That's great. Maybe. The answer to that is maybe. Let me see.
It's in the book.
It is.
Were we supposed to put our name on the URL?
Yes.
No.
Yes. Great.
Side.
You need to put your name on that, Randy.
She's already up to trouble.
So we're Josephine
Side wants to
over
know,
us.
you know.
Let me send some of these around. Here's some blanks.
Sure.
Thank you much.
We'll write your name on it for you.
So basically what this is, this little
And the
survey.
one on it.
I'm going to write your name on mine.
This
Which
little
I'll put his name on it.
This little survey just gives me a better sense of, gives me a little better sense of what folks' familiarity is with the Bible, and sort of what your working knowledge is, so that I can basically cover stuff that maybe folks aren't familiar with, or not make assumptions about what folks are familiar with in their Bibles. So thank you for completing one of these. For me, that'll help me quite a bit. Last week, we spent some time just sort of going through our Bibles and sort of getting a basic familiarity with things like the table of contents, some of the abbreviations that we can find within our Bibles, also some other resources that can be useful in helping you to understand it with a little more depth what you're actually encountering in the Bible. Does anybody remember what some of the resources that we talked about that might be useful are?
Dictionary.
What's that?
Dictionary.
Dictionary, absolutely. So all of the resources that we will talk about are available in the church library. Now, if I'm looking for the church library, where would I find it?
Library room.
Okay, yeah. So if we walk straight across the sanctuary to the other side and then hung a left, you would find the church library. And on the shelves of the library, you can find various resources like this one, right? This is the HarperCollins Bible Dictionary. HarperCollins Bible Dictionary. What sort of things could I find in a Bible dictionary? Maps, absolutely. That's one of the really beneficial things in this. Yes. Anything else?
Names.
Names, yeah. Specific names of characters within the Bible, both minor characters and major characters, and an explanation sort of why they're important or how they play into the story. Anything else?
Units of measure, maybe?
Yeah, different words, particularly like units of measure, so you have a little bit clearer sense of when they say 1 ephah, what does that mean, right? Especially, for instance, when you get into Revelation, and they'll start talking about the sort of measurements of the kingdom of heaven, right? It gives you a little bit clearer sense of what exactly they're talking about in terms of scope. Or if you are looking at the measurements for the temple, when they're talking about the way that the temple was created, it gives you a little clearer sense of what they're talking about. Yeah? It'll also tell you some things like, for instance, speaking of measure, when Jesus is talking about a day's wage, what does that actually mean? What does that actually look like? How much is that actually? Right? It just makes it a little more clear sometimes what it is that we're actually reading. Why I bring that up today is following up, and we will follow up on a question that Randy asked at the end of our last class. Does anybody remember what the question was?
Yes.
Good.
What resource do we go to, to find the interpretation of whatever we're looking at? What's our best?
Okay, yeah.
That's it, basically.
How do we know what the correct interpretation is of a particular passage? And in Randy's case, he's asking, when Jesus teaches through the parables, right? When he's teaching through the parables, time and again, it'll follow up that particular passage and say, and then Jesus went and he was teaching the disciples, and were they clear about what the parable meant?
No.
No, right? And so if they're not clear what the parable means, and the crowds don't seem to be clear about what the parable means, right? How can we be sure about what the parable actually means?
Yeah, there was an X.
There was an answer.
So, one of the things that you can do just to get a little bit of clarity when you're working your way through is to look up something like Matthew, Gospel of Matthew, right? Gospel of Matthew. Now, within the Gospel of Matthew, usually what you will find is you will find also an outline, right? An outline of that Gospel. Why might it be helpful for us? Why might it be helpful for us to see an outline of one of the books of the Bible when we're sort of trying to understand what's in there?
Get an overview.
Okay, we may get an overview. Anything else?
You know where to look for something that you're interested in.
Yeah, you may know to look for something that you're interested in. Also, oftentimes when you're looking through and you see something like an outline of a particular book, it's going to begin to draw out particular themes, and you're going to notice a couple of things that emerge from that outline. For instance, within Matthew, if you look through an outline of Matthew, you're going to start to see something that the Gospel of Matthew is very keen on sort of pointing out to you, which is the similarities between Jesus and another historical figure that's pretty important in the life of Israel. Moses. That's absolutely right. And that becomes very clear when you start to work your way through an outline of the Gospel of Matthew. You start to see in these broad sections ways in which Jesus' life seems to parallel Moses' life, right? Is this making sense at all? Is this something that you've heard before? Okay. Sometimes we're not aware of broad themes or ideas that are present until we actually are able to see it a little more clearly. Outlines can help do that sometimes. It's a really useful thing. Sometimes the outline itself, to your point, Randy, can help me see when Jesus is teaching in parables about something, does that parable connect to another part of the gospel or an adjacent discourse, right? Explicit teaching that he's going to do. Is the gospel writer going to pick up the meaning of a parable a few verses later or one passage later, right? Just trust me on this. Yes, it happens. It does happen. Right? But we're not always clued into that. We're not always clued into that, okay? So that's one of the benefits of using something like a Bible dictionary. And again, you can find these in the church library, okay? Any other sort of reference book that can be useful or resource that can be useful as we're making our way through the scriptures overall?
Concordance.
Concordance, okay. Might as well just bring all these over, right?
Hey guys.
Bring your chairs.
Not ready to feed the 5,000 here.
So yeah, this is a concordance. And what would I find in a concordance? And if you say
Cross-references.
words, I'm going to get after you. What?
Cross references.
Yeah. Yeah, basically what you're going to find, and this is what's called a complete concordance. There are different kinds. There are brief concordances, right? There's a complete concordance. The brief concordance is going to show you sort of major passages where a particular word appears throughout the Bible, right? Most of the places that are significant where that word appears, but not all of the places where it appears. A complete concordance, on the other hand, is going to take any word that you might find in the Bible, and you will be able to find all the different places that it appears. Yeah? Okay. Why might that be useful? Again, think about Randy's question, right? Think about Randy's question. How can we understand, or how can we trust that our understanding of a particular parable or teaching is accurate or correct, or what Jesus meant to teach? How might a concordance be helpful in figuring that out?
If you come across a particular word, you might learn something by seeing where else it appears.
Sure, right? So if Jesus is talking about a particular image or idea, I can look that up and I can say, where else in the Gospels does Jesus teach about that? Or not only that, but much of the time what Jesus is saying is referencing something else, right? What is he oftentimes referencing?
The Old Testament.
The Old Testament, right? Jesus' words, time and again, are either paraphrasing or pointing directly back to a passage from the Old Testament, right? What is the most common title that the people that are around Jesus call him? Teacher or rabbi, right? What do rabbis do? Okay.
Ask a silly question.
Okay. Let's try this again. Yes. Yes.
Besides teaching, what else do they do?
Yeah. What are they teaching about?
Well, in this day and age, rabbis aren't just teachers. A lot of rabbis have a full-time job besides. I mean,
Sure.
they do a lot of other things besides teach.
Yes. But in Jesus' day, when you think about the title rabbi, I want you to be really clear about something, right? We tend to think about, we hear the term rabbi and we think teacher, and okay, we encounter a lot of teachers, right, over the course of our life. Yes? I want you to have a little different sense of what teacher means in Jesus' day when you get the name rabbi. Number one, just to become a rabbi is a pretty involved process, right? So all the male observant Jewish boys, right, begin to learn the scriptures from a very early age. And how are they taught? How is this taught? Orally. You begin to memorize all of the scriptures, right? And so you will do that on up to about the age of 7, and then there will be a sort of sorting out period that goes on. And the ones who are the really best at remembering and understanding, just a rudimentary understanding of the scriptures, will then be chosen to kind of go on to a next level of study. Okay? next level of study. But it's a small, small, small minority of all of these young men, right? They'll go on to another level of study, and of them, by the time they hit about 13, there'll be another sorting out period that goes on, sifting through who's really the best of the best of the best of these. So far, so good? Okay. From those, the very best of those will then be called on to do some further study and further teaching, expanded teaching about different interpretations. So not only of the scriptures themselves, but also of all the different interpretations historically of what those scriptures have meant. Different interpretations that have come from different rabbis, right? Authoritative teachers within the tradition, and then followers of a particular famous rabbi. Sub teachings about particular passages. All of it orally taught and memorized. So if I was to ask Sai, for instance, to tell me about a particular passage in Proverbs, right? Sai would not only be able to cite that passage and everything that came before it and everything that came after it until I told her to stop talking, and be able to walk through orally all the way, right? All the way through the book of Proverbs, and could keep on going if I asked her to. But she would also be able to tell me, if I said, okay, and tell me about the various opinions about this passage from the most famous rabbis. And she would be able to immediately launch into, well, Gamaliel thought it was this, and the other thought it was this. And then I'd say, can you tell me a little bit more about one of Gamaliel's followers, or two of them, and what their dispute was about this? And she would be able to launch in from memory. From memory. And then if I said, and can you cross-reference that with another place where it talks about this same sort of wisdom literature, she would immediately be able to jump to that and then begin to tell me about that. Right? Not a rabbi yet, just a student. I sat next to a rabbinical student who was at this sort of level on a flight over to Tel Aviv one time, from the States to Tel Aviv, because he was watching me sort of thumb through a Bible as I was in undergrad studying philosophy and religion, and he was like, "So what are you studying?" And I was telling him, and he was like, "Oh."
It's on.
And I was like, "So what are you doing?" And he was like, I'm a rabbinical student." And it's like, "Oh, okay, I thought I had a sense of what that meant." I did not have a sense of what that meant, right? And here's the interesting thing. He had applied that same sort of approach to learning the New Testament. He schooled me so bad. He was able to even talk about commentaries on New Testament, right? That he had committed to memory and was able to cross-reference it. He was just going, I'd never seen anything like it. But it gave me a little clearer sense of, when we hear Jesus called rabbi, right? So the best of the best of the best eventually would be called by a rabbi. And the rabbis are like rock stars, right? Rabbis are like rock stars in ancient Israel. They are a big deal. They're not just guys that are sort of like high school geography teachers or something. No knocks on high school geography teachers, but there's a lot of those out there. These rabbis are like superstars. Superstars. So, when Jesus is called rabbi like this, right? When he's called rabbi like this, it's trying to communicate something to us pretty important about Jesus' status, right? He's achieved rock star status. He is a big, 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 big deal. And to be invited to follow a rabbi is huge. It's huge. right? It's like being asked for, roughly, it's like being asked into a cabinet position of the United States president. Are you getting the sense of why when the disciples hear Jesus and he's a rabbi, right? And he says, "Come and follow me," why you might say yes to that? Why you might drop everything and say yes to that? Were you aware of that?
No.
Does that change how you hear that story?
Yes.
Yeah. So when we hear certain words, right? When we hear certain words, we need to have a little bit clearer sense of them. And different terms and things, where else they pop up, can oftentimes give us greater clarity about what the best sort of understanding of that particular passage is, right? Does that help? Okay, I'm gonna put this away. This is heavy. And just to say, we live in a great time in terms of access to resources, right? You don't have to carry around that if you got one of these, right? It's pretty easy to just download a free concordance and you're off to the races, right? You can download any number of different Bibles. Again, most of them are free. You can go online and look up passages, right? Lots of really useful resources out there. Now, getting in a little bit further to understanding maybe the best meaning in a particular teaching or passage, another resource that we might use is what we would call a commentary. What would we find in a commentary?
Somebody's opinions about what a particular passage.
Yeah. Somebody's opinions, or probably even a collection of a sifting through of the historical sort of understanding of a passage, but also sort of taking apart piece by piece, right? What does the text say? What has the tradition been, and the various traditions about understanding this passage? What is the historical context, right? All kinds of sort of extra information that may open up this passage to you, similar to what I just did with Rabbi, right? A commentary may lift up something like, they called him Rabbi. What does Rabbi actually mean? And dig in a little bit deeper with that. Or it may say, this passage is part of a larger passage that's all about this particular theme. Does that make sense? Or this passage is going to mirror another passage later in Matthew, right? And a lot of times, especially in Matthew likes to paint visual pictures for you, right? Visual images for you in the words and the ideas that he introduces, that are going to invite you to remember things like a comparison with Moses. Time and again, you'll see Jesus participating in places or events and that'll look an awful lot like the story of Moses at one point or another. It'll also invite a comparison with David, King David, time and again. Matthew's going to do that. Now, what does that tell you about Matthew's audience? Who's Matthew writing for mostly?
Jewish people.
Jews, right? He's referencing images and history that they are most likely going to respond to, right? Whereas with John, the Gospel of John, and we'll get into this a little bit more, John is going to be using different imagery, right? Because John has a different audience in mind than Matthew does, primarily, right? Is this making sense?
But wasn't it really, at that time, almost done for Jewish scholars? How many people could read?
What's that? I'm sorry.
It must have been for Jewish scholars that Matthew was talking to, because how many people could read at that time?
A decent number could. We're now finding out that they were more literate. They were more literate than we used to think so. And we can thank Dr. Ron Tappy, who teaches just down the road at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, for helping to make that discovery about just how literate the ancient Hebrews actually were. Even dating back to the time of David, right? Even dating back to the time of David. In many of the different synagogues, they will have scrolls of the Scripture, right? And many of the children will learn to read those. So a decent number of folks are somewhat literate. But still, this emphasis on the oral tradition is really going to be pretty significant. So by the time of, your question is basically, so how many of these folks could read this gospel, right? So most of the time these gospels are going to be recited to the audience, and they're going to be listening to it, right? They're going to be listening to these recited. But they're from a tradition that can commit this to memory, right? And they've already got the Old Testament committed to memory, right? So they're really good at remembering this stuff and holding it in their heads to a degree that I think would be kind of astonishing to us. Because if I read through 3 sentences, maybe even one, on this article about Matthias, according to Acts 1:15 through 26, the successor among the 12 apostles to Judas Iscariot. And then I went around the room and asked each one of you to repeat it. By the time it got all the way to Will, I'm not sure we'd have any of the original words still. But we're dealing with a culture in which the expectation is you get it absolutely the same and right. You do not vary, you do not change. Even the cadence in which you say it is exact, 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 exact. Which is an interesting phenomenon if you actually look through the scraps, the most ancient manuscript scraps that we've got, and compare them with each other, right? From different places around the world that we gather these, how remarkably similar they are. There's very little variation. When you compare that with other mass available, mass copied sort of religious or philosophical texts from other traditions around the world, you will see substantially more variation. So one of the interesting things to note about the Scripture is just how consistent the words and the passages have been passed down over time. It's really remarkable. Yes?
Where do the Gentiles come in?
Ah!
I want to know where I came in. Did I come in with the Jews or what here?
We came in that door.
Yeah. So one of the phenomenon, and it's in many ways
It's a wonder they let us in.
so it's this idea. The term Gentile, is that a term that's familiar for folks? What does the term Gentile mean?
Not Jewish.
Non-Jew. That's basically what it means. Not Jewish. Or chosen, not chosen. Chosen, not chosen. And you're going to see this theme as being pretty important throughout the whole sort of arc, right? Whole arc of the Bible, right? Chosen, not chosen. Jew, Gentile, right? Now there are some subcategories of that, because sometimes we hear about somebody called a
Samaritan.
Samaritan's a little different.
Pagan?
No? A type of Gentile. A righteous Gentile. A righteous Gentile. And this is basically referring to somebody that is observant of the traditions, the teachings, the practices of Judaism, but was not born a Jew. Right? Not born a Jew. Now, we get into some subsets, like what's the difference between a Samaritan and a Jew?
Half-breed.
Half-breed. Tell me more. Yeah, I'm going to need context. Going to need context.
They're all children of Abraham.
Yes?
Would they think of them as more diluted?
Yeah, so basically this goes back to the times, right? The times of the deportations, the times when the people were taken into slavery and sent into exile, right? During the Babylonian captivity. And there were some people, some of them still left in the land. Still with me on this? And those folks practiced and intermarried a little bit with other people outside the sort of the 12 tribes, although those seem to be a little bit mercurial sometimes. And they worship other gods and incorporate some of the worship of other gods, and they worship Yahweh a little differently, and they even set up their own temple. And so when the Jews come back from exile, the Samaritans are here, and the Samaritans are like, hey, so glad you're back. And the Jews say, what? What?
You're not one of us anymore.
Yeah, you guys, you're not practicing the true faith. No. And this intermarriage thing that you've done, yeah, that's not going to fly either. In fact, you're kind of outside the family now, right? You don't count anymore. You're not part of the chosen anymore, right? You're a perversion of the chosen. The problem is that Jews and Gentiles are going to have to occupy a lot of the same territory, right? And Samaritans and Jews are going to become so at each other's throats all the time. And they're really going to, a lot of times Samaritans you're going to find, especially in the region of Galilee, the Samaritans are going to have a control on the cities. And they're going to have a control on the market in those cities. And many of the Jews are going to be farmers that have to sell their produce where? In the cities. And the Samaritans are in control of that. And the Samaritans set taxes and set exchange rates for produce, things like that, in ways that are very advantageous to them. Right? So if you want to sell your stuff, you got to come here to do it, but you're going to pay a price. Right? And I'm going to burn you every time I get a chance.
Now, is that what's going on in Israel, the Palestinians and the Jews?
No.
No.
Separate issue. Although there are some similar themes, let me just say. There are some similar themes that have not stopped being a problem. So, commentaries. Now, some commentaries are pretty substantial, right? Pretty substantial. And have a more academic tone to them. This Interpreter's Bible is an interesting commentary that has multiple levels of commentary depending on how involved you want to get in digging into the text. It's an oldie, but I like it a lot. I like this one quite a bit. Then you can get into smaller ones. This is also a favorite of mine anyway. This is William Barclay's Gospel of Matthew. Barclay was kind of a polymath and just had a real way with language. And his commentaries on the various books of the New Testament really very accessible and very thoughtful.
He's a good Presbyterian. This Scottish Presbyterian.
Well, of course, right? From the same, from a similar series, we've got the Layman's Bible Commentary, and again, it's fairly small, fairly light, but we'll sort of walk you through the different passages and the different themes that you're going to see in the various passages, and give you a little more insight into what various teachers have taught over time, what the various words are, the meanings of those words, to help us try to get to the most likely interpretation of that particular passage. Yeah? So lots of different commentaries, resources. Do the commentaries always agree? No. Right? No. Different commentaries are going to oftentimes take a different approach to explaining a passage. And oftentimes you can see sort of broad themes in biblical commentaries based on the era in which it is written. Yes? You can see a lot of the sort of cultural influence played out in the commentaries, again, based on the era in which it is written. And so some of the commentaries, the newest commentaries on a particular passage, will reflect changes in the, any number of things. New discoveries made about some of the cultural context, or new discoveries made about connections between one passage and another that had not been there before. One of the great authorities on Matthew, in the world at this point, is Dale Allison. Dale Allison. He did teach at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. He's now at Princeton Seminary. But Dale Allison may be the sort of foremost, or at least pretty close to the foremost voice on Matthew at this point. And some of the things that he has teased out are, well, I don't know if they've ever been quite as clearly pulled out before for us to see. Now, I'm going to pass around, just so you can get an idea of this. I'm going to pass around a couple of different things. I'll send this one around first. This first one that says framework at the top is a way of sort of diagramming and breaking down visually the Sermon on the Mount. And then the second one that I'm going to send around is a way of breaking down all of the different chapters, the different passages in Matthew. And I'm going to write the very first sentence got cut off at the top, so I'm going to write that one out for you. So that for the ones that break down the books themselves, the very top sentence that seems to be missing there is chapters 1 through 4, narrative, that's what the N stands for, introduction, the main character, Jesus, is introduced. So that's what's happening in the first 4 books of Matthew. Okay? First 4 books of Matthew. And one of the patterns that you're going to see in Matthew is this back and forth between narrative. So when we say narrative, what are we talking about? Well, telling the story, right? Telling the story. So this, in Matthew's gospel, he's going to tell the story a little bit about Jesus, and then he's going to move alternately into, say, 5 through 7. You see the D there? The D stands for discourse. Discourse. So what does discourse mean? Yeah, teaching, sometimes through conversation, but it's explicit teaching or explaining. So we get narrative, and then we get a passage explaining or teaching. Time and again through Matthew, we're going to go narrative, discourse. Narrative, discourse. Narrative, discourse. Narrative, discourse. What do you suppose happens next? Narrative, and then discourse, right? Why would Matthew structure it that way?
He was a type A personality.
Oh, that's a good guess.
Well, you would want to orient your reader.
You're on the right track.
Gave him an opportunity to explain what he was saying.
This is the way rabbis teach. This is the way rabbis teach. I tell you the story, then we teach you about the story. I tell you the story, then I teach you about the story, right? And so that's what we're going to follow in Matthew. So you're starting to see a theme here with Matthew, right? Jesus as the rabbi, Jesus as the great leader. In Matthew, who's his audience? Jews. And is he teaching to them? He's teaching to them in a way that they understand, that they recognize. Do we know that right away? If I was to ask you, so break the two sort of main components, literary components in Matthew. Just tell me, break those down for me real quick. What are they? Did anybody walk into the room today and it's like, oh yeah, it's narrative and discourse?
No.
Do you suppose we might be missing something if we don't know that? Yeah. Can we still get something out of the scripture if I don't know that? Absolutely. Absolutely. Does it help a little bit to know this part though?
Yes.
Yeah, because when Matthew begins his gospel, he's going to tell the infancy narrative or the beginning narrative in a particular way. He's going to tell it in a particular way, right? That's going to be different than what you see in Luke. Wonder what the reason might be for that. That's where we want to start to get curious, right? Why is Matthew telling it differently than Luke does? Now, there's a group of Gospels. There's a group of Gospels that are called and this may be a term you've heard before, the Synoptics. Synoptics.
Did Matthew and Luke even live close to each other?
Oh, no.
Because-
Honestly.
Because if you live in different parts of the country,
Yeah,
you have a different perspective
Right.
of what you're looking at.
absolutely.
So I don't know where they live, so it's hard to say.
Yeah, it is hard to say. Some of the best guesses about, I shouldn't say the best guesses. There are some who think that Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, comes out of Antioch, and the traditions there, and the teaching out of Antioch, because it seems to have some wording that we find specific to that region. But synoptics, let's get back to that, right? So there are three synoptic gospels. Which ones are they?
Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Right.
Luke and John.
What does this term synoptic mean?
They're grouped.
Like they're
Yes? Same or similar? From sin? Optic, what do we? View. Right? Similar view. Similar view. Why would we call them similar view?
They don't contradict one another necessarily.
Yeah, they have a lot of overlap between them in the things that they talk about, right? These three will have a bunch of overlap in terms of the various details that they bring forward or the stories that they bring forward. But they don't tell them exactly the same. Does everybody know that? They don't tell the same story exactly the same way. They have overlap, but they don't have exactly the same vantage point. To your point, right? Matthew's telling it from a particular vantage point. At this point, we would say Matthew's telling it from the vantage point of an observant Jew. Matthew's telling it from the vantage point of an observant Jew. Luke is going to be telling it a little differently. And when we take a look at Luke, you're going to begin to see that. His vantage point and the ways that he sort of organizes his gospel are going to be a little different. Now you'll see some of my notes. The handwriting on this is mine. The minuscule handwriting, yes, sir.
You gotta write bigger.
You know what's funny about that? What's funny about that is not as small as I can write. So in seminary, one time they said for the final exam, for your final exam in Greek, advanced Greek, we're going to give you a half page of blank paper, and you can write whatever would be useful to you to basically use for this exam on that piece of paper. As much as you want, as you can fit on that piece of paper. You are not allowed to photocopy and shrink. So I can write about twice as small as the smallest thing on this page. I think they still keep it at PTS's library, the study sheet that I created for that. All the declensions and all kinds of other stuff. But you'll notice that what I wrote on this is at the very bottom, the whole plot of the gospel. Look at this and you may understand why Matthew moved or cut sections different from Mark. Matthew has organized his telling in a slightly different way than Mark has, and you can begin to understand why when you start to see how Matthew's going back and forth in his discourse, and he's organizing these pictures, these visuals for you to see. But in order for him to do that, he has to change the sequence sometimes to fit stuff in a different order than Mark does. You guys with me still? It's just a little different vantage point, right? Okay. Oh gosh. Okay. So we are going to spend some more time on this second chapter. So for everybody who has not been with me before, almost never do I get through what we're supposed to get through in a week. It just doesn't happen. So we'll be back to this chapter 2 next week, and we'll pick up because there's a lot more to talk about. For instance, just look at this framework. Framework for the Sermon on the Mount. We're going to get into this, but I want you to notice what is at the very center of this framework. What is at the very center and foundation if you work your way all the way down the middle? What is it?
Lord's Prayer.
The Lord's Prayer. At the very heart of the Sermon on the Mount, the very center of it is the Lord's Prayer. If I had asked you, what is at the center of the Sermon on the Mount, would you have been able to tell me?
No.
Might that change how you understand the Lord's Prayer? Might that change how you understand the Sermon on the Mount? Yes. Might that give a little more meaning to the times in the service that we're getting ready to participate in when we say the Lord's Prayer? The Lord's Prayer is at the heart of the Sermon on the Mount. And the Sermon on the Mount is at the heart of the gospel. It is the heart of the Bible. Right? Because the Sermon on the Mount is a recap of another famous revelation on a mountaintop.
The Ten Commandments.
Yes, right? Here is who you are called to be. This is how you are called to be, to lead you into freedom. This is who you are. This is who you are called to be. In the heart of that, we recite. We don't just say the Lord's Prayer on Sundays just because it's easy and we can memorize it and say it all together. We say it very much the same way that the Jews say the Shema. Hear, O Israel, to remember who they are and whose they are. Yeah?
Yes.
You going to say it differently today? Maybe.
Yes.
Maybe. All right. I'll see you back here next week.